I never thought owning a Harley would spark such an outrageous HOA confrontation. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that entitlement knows no boundaries. I live in a quiet suburban neighborhood, where the lake breeze carries across manicured lawns, and while most of my neighbors mind their own business, there's one exception: Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA. She's the type who polices mailbox colors, measures grass height with a ruler, and sends threatening letters if you dare leave a trash can out for more than 5 minutes. For years, I avoided her drama, but that changed the day her teenage son spotted my Harley parked in my driveway. He walked right up to me, bold as brass, and announced that he wanted to try it out, as if my motorcycle were a community toy. When I told him not firmly, but politely, his face twisted with entitlement, and before I could blink, he stormed off to fetch his mother. Moments later, Karen marched across my lawn, heels clacking like war drums, screeching about how I had disrespected her son and violated HOA spirit by keeping a dangerous, noisy machine in plain sight. I stood there calm, arms crossed, as she threatened to have the HOA fine me into submission. When that didn't rattle me, she played her trump card, yelling 911 right there in front of me, dramatically claiming her son had been endangered by my refusal to let him ride. What Karen didn't realize was that at that very moment, I was preparing documents and notes for a briefing with the state attorney's office regarding ongoing HOA overreach. The timing was so poetic that even I couldn't have scripted it better. The officers arrived faster than I expected, sirens blaring, as if Karen had reported an armed standoff rather than a simple property dispute. She was waiting at the curb, with her son, practically rehearsing her victim's speech, waving her hands in wild gestures and pointing at me like I was some criminal mastermind. Her son, meanwhile, looked smug, as if convinced he'd soon be revving the throttle of my Harley with police escort. When the officers approached me, I remained calm, providing my license, registration, and proof of ownership without hesitation, watching as Karen tried to interrupt every few seconds with exaggerated cries if he threatened my child, and that motorcycle isn't even allowed here. The officers, to their credit, quickly grew tired of her theatrics and turned their attention back to the paperwork I had ready in a neat folder on the patio table. With deliberate clarity, I explained that I was already preparing for a meeting with the state attorney about ongoing HOA misconduct, and Karen's behavior would serve as yet another example of the abuse of authority we homeowners were enduring. The moment I mentioned the state attorney, her face drained of color, her shrill voice faltered, and she began to stumble over her words. The officers exchanged skeptical looks, realizing the call was nothing more than a neighbor's tantrum, disguised as an emergency. Still, I didn't gloat. I simply leaned against my Harley, the polished chrome glinting in the afternoon sun, silently letting the evidence speak louder than Karen's hollow accusations. The officers separated us, trying to calm Karen as she unleashed a torrent of complaints about motorcycles, property values, and how her son's dreams were being crushed by an uncooperative neighbor. Her voice carried across the cul-de-sac, drawing out a few curious neighbors who peeked from behind their curtains or lingered at the edges of their driveways, quietly enjoying the spectacle. Meanwhile, one officer leaned closer to me and asked in a low voice if I really was scheduled to meet with the state attorney. I slid the folder across the table, showing him the official correspondence, stamped and dated, along with documentation of the HOA's history of intimidation tactics, fines with no legal basis, and attempts to bully homeowners into compliance with rules that weren't even on the books. The officer whistled softly and nodded, clearly recognizing that this was no ordinary neighborhood spat. When I glanced toward Karen, I noticed her bravado cracking. Her gestures became smaller, her words stumbled, and her son's smug expression melted into confusion as he realized this wasn't going the way he expected. Karen tried one last desperate angle, claiming I had lured her son with the motorcycle and then threatened him when he showed interest. The officer raised an eyebrow, scribbled something in his notepad, and quietly told her that making a false police report was a serious offense. That was the first time I saw genuine fear flash across her face. For once, Karen wasn't in control, and everyone watching could sense it. Karen's confidence collapsed further when the officer asked her to repeat her claims on record, this time with his body camera capturing every word. Suddenly, her dramatic flair faltered, her voice wavered, her eyes darted toward the gathering neighbors, and her son fidgeted nervously beside her. It was one thing to spew accusations in the heat of the moment. It was another to commit to them knowing they could be used in court. I stood silently, letting the moment stretch, the roar of silence louder than any rebuttal I could have delivered. Finally, when she realized the officer wasn't going to rescue her from her own lies, she stammered out something about misunderstanding and feeling threatened but couldn't offer a shred of proof. That's when I calmly reminded everyone, including the officers, that I had multiple security cameras recording my driveway and yard, with clear footage of her son marching over to demand my Harley and Karen storming after him to escalate the situation. The officers perked up at that, one of them requesting if I could provide a copy for their report. I assured them I wouldn't, Also mentioned that those very recordings would be part of the package I was presenting to the state attorney. As evidence of systematic HOA harassment, Karen's face flushed crimson. She sputtered something about community standards, but the damage was already done. The crowd of neighbors, once passive spectators, began murmuring to each other. I could see it in their eyes. They weren't just entertained by Karen's humiliation. They were relieved that someone was finally standing up to her reign of control. When the officers asked me to hand over the security footage, I walked them inside to my study, where my laptop was already open, with files neatly organized. I had anticipated something like this would happen sooner or later. As the video played, showing Karen's son swaggering up to my Harley and demanding the keys like he was entitled to it, followed by Karen herself storming in and screaming accusations. The officers exchanged looks that spoke louder than words. One of them actually chuckled under his breath when Karen's shrill voice crackled through the audio, berating me for endangering her child simply by refusing him. By the time the clip ended, the atmosphere had shifted completely. The officers thanked me for my cooperation and warned Karen that filing false reports could have legal consequences. That warning, coupled with the murmurs of the neighbors still gathered outside, broke her carefully curated image of HOA authority. She tried to backpedal, insisting it was all just a miscommunication, but the words sounded hollow. I, on the other hand, leaned forward and said clearly enough for everyone to hear, "This will all be detailed in my briefing with the state attorney. If this HOA thinks intimidation works, they're about to learn otherwise." The weight of that sentence landed heavily. Karen's son paled, tugging on her arm as if to pull her away. And the neighbors suddenly found the courage to step closer, nodding in agreement. For the first time, Karen wasn't just facing me. She was facing a community that no longer feared her. By the time the officers wrapped up their report and left, Karen's empire of intimidation was crumbling right there on the sidewalk. She tried to retreat with what dignity she had left, dragging her son behind her, but the damage couldn't be undone. The neighbors had witnessed her meltdown. The police had logged her false claims, and I had airtight evidence, ready for my state attorney briefing. A few days later, that meeting became the turning point. Sitting across from the state attorney's staff, I laid out the timeline, the HOA's history of fabricated fines, their attempts to bully homeowners into compliance with rules that didn't exist, and finally, the police report paired with the footage of Karen's reckless 911 stunt. The attorney listened carefully, occasionally raising an eyebrow as the weight of the evidence mounted. When I finished, they assured me an investigation into HOA misconduct would be opened, and they thanked me for standing firm where others had been too intimidated to push back. Walking out of that office, I knew the tide had shifted. Karen, once untouchable in her self-appointed role as HOA enforcer, had exposed herself as reckless, dishonest, and dangerous to her own credibility. Word spread quickly around the neighborhood, not because I bragged, but because neighbors who had been silent for years finally found the courage to talk. By the end of that month, a movement had begun to demand accountability from the HOA board, and Karen's seat at the table was no longer secure. As for me, every time I wheel my Harley into the driveway and fire it up, I do so without hesitation, the deep rumble serving as a reminder that standing your ground against tyranny, no matter how small scale it may seem, is always worth it.